You have to understand, there was nothing like it in the history of known space. Nothing even close. I stood on the observation deck of the Meridian's edge, my breath fogging the reinforced transparasteel as I pressed my face against it like some wide-eyed cadet on his first deployment. But I wasn't a cadet. I was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen, Fleet Communications Officer, 12 years of service under my belt. And even I had never seen anything that made my heart pound like this. The Armada stretched beyond the curve of vision itself. Dreadnoughts the size of small moons, their hulls gleaming like polished obsidian against the star field. Carrier groups arranged in perfect geometric formations, each one trailing clouds of fighters and support craft like silver dust. The banner ships of 17 different star nations flew in coordinated majesty. The crimson and gold of the Terran Federation, the deep purple of the Andorian Crown worlds, the shifting aurora patterns of the Centauri Collective. 47,000 vessels. I'd run the numbers myself through the fleet registry. 47,000 ships carrying the combined might of the greatest civilizations our galaxy had ever known. Beautiful, isn't she? Admiral Korath's voice carried that familiar mix of pride and weight that all flag officers seemed to develop. The Andraxian's scaled features caught the light from the nearest dreadnought's running lights as he joined me at the viewport. "It's overwhelming, sir," I managed. And it was. The sheer scale made you feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something impossibly grand. Every ship out there represented millions of people back home who believed in what we were doing, who trusted us to carry their hopes across the void. The Admiral's four-fingered hand settled on my shoulder. "In 3 hours, we make the jump to Terminus Sector. The enemy won't know what hit them." His voice carried absolute certainty. "This Armada will end the war, Commander. Not just win it, end it completely." I nodded, though part of me wondered if anything could truly end a conflict that had raged for 37 years across half the galaxy. The hegemony had proven resilient, adapting to every strategy we'd thrown at them. But looking out at this vast congregation of military might, doubt seemed foolish. The communications array crackled to life behind us. "All vessels, this is Fleet Command. Final systems check commences in 90 minutes. All department heads report readiness status to your respective command ships." I turned from the viewport, duty calling. But as I headed toward the comm center, I caught one last glimpse of the Armada through a side portal. The formation had shifted slightly, and for just a moment, the arrangement of lights looked less like an organized military force and more like a vast constellation, beautiful, distant, and somehow fragile against the infinite dark. The next few hours blurred together in a symphony of final preparations. Fuel lines disconnected from depot ships, last-minute personnel transfers via shuttle, encrypted battle plans uploaded to tactical networks. Every ship in the Armada hummed with controlled energy, like a massive instrument being tuned before a concert. I spent most of that time in Communications Central, a cramped space lined with quantum relay stations and holodesks. My team worked with quiet efficiency, testing emergency channels, verifying encryption protocols, ensuring that once we jumped, the 47,000 ships of the Armada could still function as one coordinated force. "Long-range scanners show the wormhole gate is stable," reported Ensign Torres, her fingers dancing across tactical displays. "Engineering confirms all jump drives are synchronized." The artificial gravity gave that familiar subtle lurch that meant we were moving into position. Through the overhead speakers came Admiral Korath's voice, now addressing the entire Armada. "This is Admiral Korath to all vessels. In 30 minutes we will make the jump to Terminus Sector. You all know what awaits us there, the final stronghold of an enemy that has brought nothing but suffering to our worlds for nearly 4 decades. I found myself leaning forward, caught up in the moment despite having heard variations of this speech a dozen times in planning sessions. Today we don't fight as 17 separate nations. We fight as one Armada, one force, one will. The jump will take us directly into hegemony core space, bypassing their outer defenses entirely. When we emerge, we will end this war not through years of grinding attrition, but through one decisive strike that history will remember forever. The cheers echoing through the comm channels from across the fleet gave me chills. 47,000 ships, millions of souls, all united in purpose, all believing in the same dream of victory. Jump in 15 minutes. May the stars guide us safely to glory. I switched to the tactical display and watched as the Armada oriented itself toward the massive wormhole gate, a construct of exotic matter and folded space-time that appeared as a slowly rotating ring of silver fire against the darkness. Ships arranged themselves in perfect jumping order. Scouts first, then the main battle groups, support vessels protected in the center, heavy dreadnoughts bringing up the rear. The Meridian's Edge held position in the fourth wave, part of Admiral Korath's command group. From here, I could see the first ships beginning their approach to the gate. "All stations report ready," came the voice from Fleet Command. "Wormhole integrity at maximum, jump coordinates locked in." The scout ships hit the gate first, their sleek forms stretching and distorting as they passed through the event horizon before vanishing in flashes of brilliant light. Then the destroyers, their angular hulls disappearing into that ring of fire one by one. The sight never got old. Watching ships translate through folded space, traveling impossible distances in the blink of an eye. Second wave, commenced jump. More ships disappeared into the gate, the wormhole's energy signature growing brighter with each passage. I checked my readings. Everything looked perfect. The gate was handling the massive traffic with mechanical precision. Third wave, commenced jump. Now it was cruisers and battle carriers, their massive bulk seeming to stretch the gate's aperture as they passed through. The light was becoming almost blinding, but the energy readings held steady. Fourth wave, prepare for jump. My hands moved across the console without conscious thought, making final adjustments to our communication arrays. In 30 seconds, we'd be in Terminus Sector, ready to coordinate the largest military action in galactic history. Fourth wave, commence jump. The Meridian's Edge accelerated toward the gate, and I felt that familiar sensation in my stomach as we approached the event horizon. The silver fire grew larger, filling our viewports. And then, the universe screamed. I'm not sure there's another way to describe it. Every warning klaxon in the ship went off simultaneously. The lights flickered. The artificial gravity stuttered. And through it all came this sound. Not audible exactly, but something felt through the bones, through the quantum foam itself. "Gate collapse!" someone shouted over the chaos. "The wormhole is collapsing!" I looked up at the main display and watched in horror as the perfect ring of silver fire began to warp and twist. Ships that had been smoothly transitioning through the gate were suddenly stretched across impossible geometries, their hull signatures scattered across multiple dimensions at once. The Meridian's Edge shook like a toy in a hurricane. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as we tumbled through space-time, caught in the death throes of a collapsing wormhole. The last thing I remember clearly from those moments was the tactical display, showing the positions of our fleet. Half the Armada, including most of the scout ships and advanced battle groups, had made it through the gate before the collapse. They were presumably in Terminus Sector now, cut off from us, but at least where they were supposed to be. The rest of us, some 23,000 ships, were being dragged through the collapsing gate into somewhere else. When the shaking finally stopped, and the emergency lights gave way to normal illumination, I pulled myself up from the deck where I'd been thrown. Around me, my team was doing the same, checking for injuries and damage. "Status report," I called out, my voice hoarse. We're somewhere," Ensign Torres replied, staring at her navigation console with a confused expression. "I'm reading 23,712 ships in our immediate vicinity, but sir." She looked up at me with wide eyes. "I'm not reading any stars." I moved to the main display and felt my heart sink. She was right. The fleet floated in perfect formation exactly as we had before the jump, but beyond our running lights was nothing but absolute darkness. No stars, no nebulae, no galaxies in the distance. Just empty void, stretching in all directions as far as our sensors could reach. "Where are we?" someone whispered. I stared out at the 23,000 ships of what remained of our great armada, their lights like lonely candles in an ocean of night, and realized I had no answer. We had set out as the pride of 17 nations, the unstoppable force that would end a war and reshape the galaxy. Now we were refugees in the dark, cut off from everything we'd ever known. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought began to take shape. What if there was no way home? The first 72 hours were the worst kind of organized chaos. Every ship in our makeshift fleet was running full sensor sweeps, desperately trying to find something, anything, that would tell us where we were. Navigation officers worked around the clock, attempting to triangulate our position using quantum signatures, gravitational anomalies, background radiation patterns, anything that might give us a reference point in this endless dark. I barely left the communications center during those 3 days. My job was to coordinate the search efforts, relay findings between ships, and try to maintain some semblance of order among 23,000 vessels that had suddenly found themselves further from home than any expedition in recorded history. The reports came in with depressing regularity. Meridian's Edge, this is the Iron Covenant. Long-range sensors detect no stellar objects within 50 light-years. Command, this is the Stellar Phoenix. Gravitational mapping shows no significant mass concentrations in our vicinity. Wherever we are, we're in deep intergalactic space. Meridian's Edge, Quantum Dreamer reporting. We've launched probe drones in all directions. Initial telemetry suggests. Well, sir, it suggests we're in a genuine void. No background radiation consistent with any known region of space. That last one hit me like a physical blow. I'd been holding on to hope that we were simply in some uncharted region of our own galaxy, maybe thrown off course by the wormhole collapse. But if we were truly in intergalactic space between galaxies, then we were looking at distances that even our fastest ships couldn't cross in 1,000 lifetimes. The silence was the worst part. In normal space, there's always something. The whisper of stellar winds, the background hum of cosmic radiation, the distant gravitational songs of orbiting bodies. Here, there was nothing. Our ship's sensors strained against an emptiness so complete it felt almost hostile. Some of the crew started calling it the hungry dark, and I understood why. It seemed to swallow not just light and sound, but hope itself. Sleep became a luxury none of us could afford. I found myself catching 2 or 3 hours at my station between communication cycles, always waking to the same endless stream of negative reports. No stars, no planets, no way home. On the second day, Chief Petty Officer Martinez approached me with something I'd never seen before in 12 years of service. A formal request from the crew for psychological counseling services to be expanded fleet-wide. Morale was plummeting faster than our fuel reserves. "Sir," he said, his usually steady voice shaking slightly, "the crew is asking questions I don't have answers for. They want to know when we're going home. They want to know if their families will ever learn what happened to us. And frankly, sir, I want to know those things too." I looked at Martinez, a 20-year veteran who'd served through the worst battles of the war without flinching, and saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of death in combat, which he'd faced countless times, but fear of dying forgotten in the dark, his story never told. "We'll figure this out, Chief," I told him, but the words felt hollow, even as I spoke them. Admiral Korath called a command meeting on the 4th day. The Meridian's Edge was designated as the temporary flagship, partly because we had the most sophisticated communication arrays, and partly because Admiral Korath was the highest-ranking officer among the stranded fleet. I attended the meeting as communications liaison, sitting at a holotable surrounded by the ghostly blue projections of captains and admirals from across the fleet. The diversity that had once been our strength, 17 different species, cultures, and military traditions working together, now felt like a complication we couldn't afford. "Ladies, gentlemen, honored beings," Admiral Korath began, his scaled features betraying none of the exhaustion I knew he felt. "Our situation is grave, but not hopeless. Chief Navigator Tessaran, please brief us on your findings." The Centauri officer's hologram flickered as she activated her presentation. Charts and stellar maps appeared in the air between us, but they were all marked with the same devastating conclusion. Based on our analysis of local space-time curvature and the complete absence of detectable stellar objects, we believe we have been transported to a region of space between galactic clusters. The nearest detectable galaxy appears to be... She paused, and I saw her confidence waver. Approximately 200 million light-years away. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 million light-years. Even if we could somehow jury-rig our jump drives to work without a destination gate, we'd need more fuel than existed in a dozen solar systems. Captain Vex of the Stormbreaker, a gruff Terran veteran, was the first to speak. What about the ships that made it through the original jump? Is there any chance they could mount a rescue? Admiral Korath's expression darkened. Even if they survived their encounter with the hegemony forces, they have no way of knowing where we are. The wormhole collapse scattered us across dimensional barriers they can't detect, let alone cross. So we're on our own, stated Commander Zilnek of the Andraxian Defense Corps. We're on our own, the Admiral confirmed. I watched the faces around the table, some grim, others calculating, a few showing the first signs of panic. These were experienced military officers, leaders who'd commanded fleets through decades of war. But nothing in their training had prepared them for this. "What are our supply projections?" asked Captain Moreau of the Celestial Dawn. The logistics report was as bad as I'd feared. Fleet Quartermaster Rain's hologram materialized, and her usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by stark professionalism. Combined stores across all vessels give us approximately 4 months of full rations, assuming standard consumption. We can stretch that to 8 months on emergency protocols, but that means reduced caloric intake and limited non-essential systems. Fuel? Admiral Korath asked. 6 months at standard operational levels. Longer if we shut down non-critical systems and consolidate crews to reduce the number of active vessels. 6 months. In 6 months, we'd be drifting hulks in the dark, waiting for life support to fail. Captain Drex of the Void Hunter, a pragmatic Calorian, leaned forward. What about crew transfers? If we consolidate populations onto our most efficient vessels, we could extend operational time significantly. Which ships would we abandon? Asked Captain Thrace of the Golden Horizon, and there was something sharp in his tone that made everyone pay attention. The obvious choices would be vessels with the highest maintenance requirements and lowest strategic value, Drex replied matter-of-factly. Strategic value to whom? Thrace's projection turned to face each of us in turn. My ship carries 800 souls. Are their lives less strategic than the crew of a dreadnought? The argument that followed revealed the first major crack in our unity. Ship captains began advocating for their own vessel's importance, each making cases for why other ships should be sacrificed for the greater good. National allegiances, previously subsumed under our common cause, began to resurface. Are there any resources we can exploit in local space? Asked Captain Vex, cutting through the growing tension. Chief Science Officer Dr. Yaman spoke up from her position aboard the research vessel Cosmic Inquiry. We've detected 3 planetary bodies within our sensor range. All appear to be rogue planets, worlds ejected from their original solar systems and now drifting in interstellar space. 2 are gas giants with no useful resources for our purposes. The third? She paused, consulting her notes. The third is a rocky world, roughly Earth-sized, with significant mineral deposits. A spark of hope flickered in the room. What kind of minerals? Admiral Korath asked. Heavy metals, rare earth elements, and... This is interesting. What appear to be processed materials. Refined metals in geometric patterns that suggest artificial construction. Ruins? Commander Zilnek leaned forward. Are you saying there's evidence of civilization? Was, Dr. Yaman corrected. Whatever was there is long dead. Our scans detect no energy signatures, no atmosphere, no signs of current activity. But yes, there are structures on the surface, large ones. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. covering everything from crew rotation schedules to the possibility of cannibalizing smaller vessels to extend the operational life of our larger ships. But through it all, I found myself thinking about that dead world floating in the void. Someone had been here before us. Someone had built cities on a planet cast adrift between the galaxies, and then... what? What had happened to them? Had they died slowly as their resources ran out? Or had something else claimed them? After the meeting, I returned to my station and threw myself into coordinating the fleet's exploration efforts. We organized our ships into search groups, each tasked with mapping a different section of local space. The Meridian's Edge would lead a small task force to investigate the mysterious dead world. But even as we prepared for exploration, the psychological toll of our situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The medical bay reported a sharp increase in cases of acute anxiety and depression. Sleep disorders were epidemic. Some crew members were developing what the doctors were calling void sickness, a condition where prolonged exposure to the absolute darkness outside our viewports was causing disorientation and panic attacks. I started receiving reports of minor incidents across the fleet. A fight broke out on the Stellar Vengeance over food rations. The crew of the Distant Thunder staged a work slowdown, demanding answers about our survival plans. On the Crimson Dawn, 3 junior officers were arrested for attempting to steal a shuttle, claiming they wanted to try to find the way home. As the days passed, other problems began to surface. Little things at first: disputes over resource allocation, complaints about the Admiral's decisions, grumbling from crew members who wanted to attempt the impossible journey home rather than waste time exploring empty space. The first real incident happened during the second week. I was monitoring communications traffic when I picked up an unauthorized transmission between the Golden Horizon and the Stellar Vengeance. Captain Thrace of the Golden Horizon was arguing with Captain Corwin about fuel distribution. "Your people are running full environmental systems while my crew is shivering in the dark," Thrace was saying. "If we're going to survive this, the resource sharing has to be equitable." "Equitable according to whom?" Corwin shot back. "My ship carries twice your crew complement and 3 times your scientific equipment. Of course we need more power." "Scientific equipment won't matter if we all starve," Thrace replied, and there was something in his tone that made me sit up straighter. Maybe it's time we started making harder choices about which ships are worth keeping operational. I immediately flagged the transmission for Admiral Korath's attention, but the damage was already done. Within hours, similar conversations were popping up across the fleet. Ships were starting to eye each other not as fellow survivors, but as potential sources of supplies. The unity that had made us the greatest armada in galactic history was beginning to crack. By the end of the second week, we had our first defection. Captain Reen of the Star Wanderer, a fast scout ship with extended range capabilities, announced his intention to attempt the journey back to known space. Despite Admiral Korath's direct orders to remain with the fleet, the Star Wanderer activated its jump drive and vanished into the darkness. "They'll die out there," Dr. Yaman told me privately after monitoring their departure. "Their fuel won't last 1/10 of the distance they need to travel." But I understood Captain Reen's decision. Sometimes the illusion of action, even futile action, was preferable to sitting still while death approached on a schedule. 3 weeks in, we reached the dead world. Dr. Yaman had been right about the ruins. They covered nearly 1/4 of the planet's surface. Vast geometric structures that spoke of a civilization far more advanced than anything in our home galaxy. The architecture was alien but somehow familiar, as if whoever built it had faced the same fundamental challenges of survival that we now faced. As our archaeological teams began their surveys, I found myself studying the surface through the Meridian's Edge's powerful telescopes. The cities, for that's what they clearly were, showed signs of expansion and modification over what must have been centuries. Someone had lived here for a long time, adapting and building as their situation changed. What we found in the ruins changed everything. Deep beneath the largest structure, our archaeological team discovered a chamber filled with crystalline data storage devices. Most were corrupted beyond recovery, but Dr. Yaman's team managed to extract partial records from several intact units. The translation process took 3 days. When Dr. Yaman finally requested a private meeting with Admiral Korath and his senior staff, her expression told me we weren't going to like what she'd found. "The records are fragmentary," she began, "but the story they tell is relevant to our situation. This world was once home to refugees like us, survivors of some cosmic catastrophe who found themselves stranded in the void between galaxies. They called themselves the Eternal Fleet." The name sent a chill through me. It sounded so much like what we'd called ourselves, the Great Armada, the pride of the galaxy. Initially, they maintained military discipline and cooperation. They built settlements on this world, tried to establish sustainable resource extraction. For several decades, they succeeded. But as time passed and their situation became increasingly hopeless, unity began to break down. Dr. Yaman's voice grew quieter. "The records speak of resource wars, of ships turning on each other, of the slow collapse of civilization as desperation set in. The final entries mention something they called the Hunger Years, when the survivors had been reduced to scavenging from their own dead ships." I stared at the translated text scrolling across my screen, and for the first time since our arrival in the void, I felt true fear. Not fear of death, that was abstract, distant. This was fear of what we might become. "How did it end?" Admiral Korath asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The last clear record is a personal log from someone called Fleet Commander Vexthal. He wrote, 'We came here as the pride of 1,000 worlds. We will die as scavengers in the dark. May whatever force brought us to this place show mercy to those who find our bones.' Outside my viewport, the 23,000 ships of our fleet hung in formation against the starless dark, their lights reflecting off the surface of the dead world below. And I wondered how long it would be before we started looking at each other not as allies, but as resources." The archaeological team found more than just records in those ruins. They found mass graves, thousands upon thousands of beings buried in orderly rows, suggesting that even at the end, some attempt at dignity had been maintained. But they also found evidence of less orderly deaths, scorch marks from energy weapons, blast craters where structures had been destroyed in fighting, areas where the very stone had been melted by the kind of weapons that should only have been used against external enemies. The Eternal Fleet had destroyed itself in a cannibalistic war for survival. And looking at the growing tensions in our own fleet, at the way captains were beginning to calculate which ships were worth saving and which were expendable, I began to fear we were following the same path. The void, I was beginning to realize, didn't just swallow light and matter. It swallowed hope too. And once that was gone, what was left of us would be something far worse than death. The first shots were fired 6 weeks after our arrival in the void. I was in Communications Central, coordinating supply transfers between the Meridian's edge and 3 smaller vessels, when every alarm on the ship started screaming at once. The tactical display lit up like a festival of death. Energy weapons fire, missile launches, ships breaking formation. "What the hell?" I started, but the answer came through the comm channels before I could finish the question. "This is Captain Thrace of the Golden Horizon. The Stellar Vengeance has opened fire on my ship without provocation. We are returning fire in self-defense." Admiral Korath's voice cut through the chaos. "All vessels, this is Admiral Korath. Cease fire immediately. Captain Thrace, Captain Corwin, report to Fleet Command for immediate—" "Fleet Command?" Captain Corwin's voice was raw with fury. "Your precious Fleet Command just watched them steal 3 weeks' worth of our rations. I've got 800 people on this ship, Admiral, and I won't let them starve so Thrace's crew can eat full meals." The tactical display showed both ships maneuvering for better firing positions, their escorts moving to support them. What had started as an argument over food distribution had escalated into the first open warfare within our fleet. I found myself leaning forward, my hands gripping the console as I watched the impossible unfold. These were ships from our own fleet, crews I'd coordinated with for months, officers I'd shared meals with during the long journey to the wormhole gate. Now they were trying to kill each other over protein bars and water rations. The Golden Horizon's defensive systems came online, its point defense cannons tracking the incoming missiles from Corwin's ship. But the Stellar Vengeance was a heavy cruiser built for ship-to-ship combat, while the Golden Horizon was a transport vessel with minimal armament. I watched in horror as the Golden Horizon's port side erupted in a chain of explosions. Hull breaches vented atmosphere into the void, and I could see tiny figures, people, spinning away into the darkness. Captain Thrace's voice came through the comm, desperate now. "Mayday, mayday! We have multiple hull breaches, life support failing in sections 7 through 12. Stand down, Corwin." Admiral Korath's command carried all the authority of decades of military service. "That's an order." But Captain Corwin was beyond orders now. Orders from who? A flag officer who's been rationing fuel while keeping his own ship at full power? We're all dead anyway, Admiral. At least this way. Some of us might live a little longer. Through the external cameras, I could see the Stellar Vengeance's weapon batteries glowing with charging energy. Corwin wasn't just trying to disable the Golden Horizon, he was going for a kill shot. "Sir," Ensign Torres called out from her station, "the Azure Dream and the Far Wanderer are moving to intercept. They're trying to get between the combatants." On screen, I watched two smaller vessels, both civilian transports that had been pressed into fleet service, desperately trying to position themselves as shields between the warring ships. Captain Martinez of the Azure Dream was broadcasting on all frequencies. "Please stop this. There are families on both those ships, children." But the void had already started changing us. I saw it in Corwin's response, cold, calculated, inhuman. Then they should have thought of that before they stole food from my crew. The Stellar Vengeance launched another barrage, this time targeted not just at the Golden Horizon, but at the ships trying to protect it. The Far Wanderer took a direct hit to its engine section and went spinning out of control, its hull splitting like rotten fruit. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind me. The Golden Horizon's reactor went critical. The explosion was brilliant against the absolute darkness of the void, a star born and dying in seconds, taking 800 souls with it. The shockwave hit the nearby ships, sending them tumbling through space like leaves in a hurricane. The silence that followed was deafening. Across the fleet, 23,000 ships floated in the darkness, their crews processing what they'd just witnessed. We had traveled across the galaxy as allies. Now we were watching our own ships murder each other for scraps. Admiral Korath's voice, when it finally came, sounded like that of a man who'd aged decades in minutes. "Captain Corwin, you will surrender yourself for court-martial immediately." "Court-martial?" Corwin laughed, and there was madness in it. "Admiral, we're 200 million light-years from the nearest court. We're 200 million light-years from law, from civilization, from everything that made us human. There's only survival now." I watched the tactical display as the Stellar Vengeance began moving toward the debris field where the Golden Horizon had died. "What are you doing, Corwin?" Admiral Korath demanded. "Salvage operations," came the reply. 800 people just died, Admiral. Their supplies died with them, but their ship's storage compartments might have survived the explosion. Waste not, want not. The sight of Corwin's crew using industrial manipulator arms to pull supply crates from the wreckage of their former allies was somehow worse than the battle itself. This was desecration, pure and simple. But it was also practical, and in the void, practicality was becoming more important than morality. The Stellar Vengeance powered up its jump drive. "Where do you think you're going, Captain?" Admiral Korath demanded. "Hunting," Corwin replied. "There are plenty of smaller ships out there, ships with supplies and not enough firepower to stop me from taking them." The Stellar Vengeance vanished in a flash of twisted space-time, taking its crew and its cargo of stolen supplies into the dark. Within hours, 3 more ships had followed its example. The fleet that had been our strength was becoming our executioner. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the battle in my mind, trying to understand how we'd fallen so far so fast. 6 weeks ago, we'd been the pride of 17 civilizations. Now we were murdering each other for protein paste and recycled water. I found myself in the observation deck, staring out at the other ships in our formation. Their running lights looked like stars in the darkness, but I knew that was an illusion. Stars were sources of light and energy. These ships were dying embers, consuming themselves to stay alive just a little longer. Chief Martinez found me there around 0300 hours. Can't sleep either, sir. I shook my head. Keep thinking about Captain Thrace. I served with him on the Victorious during the Kepler campaign. He was a good man. Good father, too. Had 3 kids back on New Geneva. Had, Martinez repeated quietly. Past tense now. How did we get here, Chief? How did we go from the greatest military force in galactic history to this? Martinez was quiet for a long moment, then said, My grandfather used to tell me stories about the old Earth wars. He said the worst thing about being a soldier wasn't the enemy trying to kill you. It was watching good people turn into something else when they got desperate enough. Over the following week, I spent most of my time monitoring increasingly desperate communications between Admiral Korath and the remaining ship captains. The conversations were revealing in ways that made my skin crawl. Language that had once been about cooperation and mutual aid was being replaced by terms like acceptable losses, resource optimization, and survival prioritization. Some captains were calling for immediate military action against the rogue vessels. Others were arguing for defensive alliances, smaller groups of ships that could protect each other. A few were openly discussing which ships would be acceptable losses if it meant extending the survival of the rest. Captain Sarah Chen of the Dawn's Promise was brutally honest during one fleet-wide conference. We need to face facts. 23,000 ships cannot survive on the resources we have, but 2,000 might. The question isn't whether some of us will die. It's who gets to choose who lives. The responses to her statement were telling. Some officers expressed outrage at the suggestion. Others asked for specific criteria for selection. A few asked who would be making the choices. Admiral Korath tried to maintain military discipline, but I could see the strain wearing on him. During our private briefings, he would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare off into space, as if he was trying to remember who he used to be. Commander, he said to me during one such meeting, I need you to begin monitoring all intership communications. Flag any discussions about resource hoarding, alliance formations, or potential hostile actions. Sir, are you asking me to spy on our own captains? I'm asking you to help me prevent more incidents like what happened to the Golden Horizon. If that means surveillance, then yes, that's what I'm asking. The psychological evaluations coming in from across the fleet painted a picture of collective madness. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, our chief psychiatrist, requested a private meeting with Admiral Korath and his senior staff. Her report was devastating. We're seeing a complete breakdown of social bonds, she explained, her usually calm demeanor cracked with exhaustion. Crew members are hoarding personal rations, forming tribal groups based on ship of origin, and in some cases, openly discussing violence against other crew members they perceive as threats to their survival. What about command structure? Admiral Korath asked. Deteriorating rapidly. On at least 7 ships, junior officers have attempted to relieve their captains of command. On the Deep Horizon, the crew has essentially mutinied and established what they call a survival council. They're making decisions based purely on resource optimization, with no regard for military protocol or, well, human decency. She pulled up a data pad and continued reading. The Stellar Pride has implemented what they call genetic selection protocols, essentially a breeding program to ensure long-term species survival. The Iron Will is rationing not just food but oxygen, with allocation based on skill assessments and survival value calculations. The Phoenix Rising has established a caste system where technical personnel receive full rations while general crew members receive subsistence-level nutrition. I thought about the ruins we'd found on the dead world, the evidence of warfare and cannibalism. Doctor, in your professional opinion, how long before we reach the point of complete social collapse? She looked at me with hollow eyes. Commander Chen, I believe we passed that point 3 days ago. We're just watching the aftermath now. The proof came sooner than even she had predicted. I was pulled from sleep by Martinez, shaking my shoulder. Sir, you need to see this. Priority transmission from the Aurora's light. I stumbled to the communications station, still half asleep, and activated the channel. Captain Sandra Reeves appeared on the screen, but she looked nothing like the composed officer I'd known. Her uniform was torn, there was blood on her face, and her eyes held the wild look of someone who'd seen too much. "This is a general broadcast to all fleet vessels," she began, her voice shaking. "6 hours ago, the Deep Horizon and the Star Hunter appeared in our sector. They demanded we transfer half our remaining supplies to them. When we refused, they boarded us." I felt my blood turn to ice. Boarding actions were acts of war. "They took everything," Captain Reeves continued. "Food, water, medical supplies, spare parts, even the clothes off some of our crew. But that wasn't the worst part." She paused, struggling with what came next. "They took people, too. 63 of my crew. They said they needed workers for their resource extraction operations." Slavery. We'd descended to slavery. The boarding party was led by Captain Morrison of the Star Hunter. When I protested, he told me that military ranks don't exist anymore. He said there are only 2 kinds of people now, those with weapons and those who serve them. Her voice broke. "They're treating our people like property. Like livestock." The transmission cut out, leaving us in stunned silence. Within minutes, similar reports were coming in from across the fleet. Ships were forming predatory alliances, hunting weaker vessels for supplies and crew. The careful military hierarchy that had held us together was dissolving into something far more primitive. I began receiving reports of what these rogue fleets were doing with their captives, and each report was worse than the last. Some were being used as forced labor, working in dangerous conditions to strip resources from damaged ships. Others were being held as hostages to ensure compliance from other vessels. A few reports mentioned biological resource management, a euphemism that made me sick to my stomach. Admiral Korath called an emergency meeting of all remaining loyal captains. The turnout was depressing. Less than half the fleet responded to his summons. The rest were either too far away, too damaged to maintain communications, or had gone rogue entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Korath began, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. "We are no longer a military fleet. We are survivors in a hostile environment, and that environment includes our former allies." Captain Vex of the Stormbreaker leaned forward. "Admiral, with respect, what are you suggesting? That we abandon military protocol entirely?" "I'm suggesting that military protocol is a luxury we can no longer afford," Korath replied. "Captain Morrison was right about one thing. There are only 2 kinds of people out here now. Those with enough strength to protect what they have, and those who become victims." The discussion that followed was unlike anything I'd witnessed in 12 years of military service. These were career officers, people who'd spent their lives in service to ideals of duty, honor, and sacrifice. Now they were debating the merits of preemptive strikes against potentially hostile ships, resource raids on weaker vessels, and the establishment of protective custody for crews whose ships could no longer sustain them. Captain Elena Rodriguez of the Distant Star made a proposal that exemplified how far we'd fallen. "We should establish protocols for mercy killings of ships that are beyond salvage. It's more humane than letting them drift until their life support fails, and we can redistribute their supplies to vessels with better survival chances." The scary thing wasn't that she proposed it. The scary thing was how many of the other captains nodded in agreement. The transformation was swift and brutal. Ships that had maintained disciplined military operations for decades suddenly reorganized along survival lines. Crews were divided into essential and non-essential personnel. Weapons were distributed based on loyalty rather than rank. Resources were hoarded rather than shared. The Meridian's Edge became the center of what Admiral Korath optimistically called the Loyalist Alliance, about 4,000 ships that still recognized his authority. But even within our own alliance, trust was breaking down. Captains who had served together for years were now viewing each other with suspicion, calculating whether their former friends might become threats. I found myself assigned new duties beyond communications. Admiral Korath made me his intelligence coordinator, which was a polite way of saying I was now spying on our own ships, monitoring their communications for signs of disloyalty or resource hoarding. The reports I filed painted a picture of rapid social decay that went beyond anything Dr. Chen had predicted. The crew of the Valiant Dawn had established a religion based around resource conservation, declaring anyone who wasted supplies to be a heretic worthy of spacing. The Stellar Fury had implemented a system where crew members could trade personal possessions for additional food rations, leading to a barter economy based on desperation. Most disturbing was the Evening Star, where the crew had begun conducting efficiency evaluations of their fellow ship members. Anyone deemed insufficiently productive was transferred to minimal resource allocation and assigned to hazardous duties like external hull repairs without proper safety equipment. It was murder disguised as resource management. 3 months after the first shots were fired, we encountered the Devourer. That wasn't its original name. It had been the Shining Dawn, a hospital ship with a crew of medical professionals and humanitarian workers. Dr. Marcus Hayes had been the chief medical officer, a man I'd known personally from fleet medical conferences. He'd been dedicated to saving lives, passionate about his work, and deeply committed to the humanitarian principles that had motivated him to volunteer for the expedition. But when Captain Hayes, he'd apparently promoted himself, established contact with us, the vessel that appeared on our screens was almost unrecognizable. The ship's hull had been modified with weapons salvaged from destroyed vessels. Strange additions and attachments gave it the appearance of some predatory deep-sea creature. What had once been pristine white medical bay viewports were now dark, tinted red from the inside. The ship's medical cross had been replaced with a symbol that looked like a twisted version of the traditional caduceus, 2 serpents wrapped around a bone instead of a staff. But it was Captain Hayes himself who truly shocked me. The man who appeared on our communication screen bore little resemblance to the gentle doctor who had volunteered to serve the fleet's medical needs. His face was gaunt, his skin had a sickly pallor, and his eyes held a predatory gleam that made my skin crawl. When he smiled, I could see that several of his teeth had been replaced with metal implants, not dental work, but crude modifications that gave him the appearance of some cannibalistic beast. "Admiral Korath," he said, his voice carrying a casual menace that made my skin crawl. "How pleasant to encounter old friends in this wasteland." "Captain Hayes," Admiral Korath replied carefully, "your ship appears to have undergone modifications." Hayes laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Modifications, yes. We've had to adapt to our new circumstances. Survival requires flexibility in one's moral frameworks." "What do you want, Hayes?" "Want?" "Admiral, I want what we all want, to live another day in this beautiful void. And to do that, I need supplies. Your ships look well-maintained, well-fed crews. It seems you've been hoarding resources while others starve." I noticed that Hayes was wearing what looked like a necklace, but as the camera angle shifted, I realized it was made of small bones. Human finger bones by the size and shape. "We're managing our supplies responsibly," Admiral Korath said. "If you need assistance—" "Assistance?" Hayes cut him off. "Admiral, I'm not here to beg. I'm here to negotiate. You have resources I need. I have services I can provide in return." "What kind of services?" Hayes gestured off-screen, and the camera angle shifted to show what was behind him. I had to fight not to vomit. The medical bay of his ship had been converted into something that belonged in a nightmare. Bodies were suspended from the ceiling by cables and tubes. Some were clearly dead, being processed for purposes I didn't want to contemplate. Others were still alive, their eyes wide with terror and madness. "Sustainable protein production," Hayes said conversationally. "Organ harvesting for medical supplies. Chemical processing of human remains for trace minerals. Amazing what the human body contains when you know how to extract it efficiently." Several of the captains in our meeting cut their transmissions immediately. I heard someone retching off screen. Admiral Korath's face had gone completely white. "You're talking about cannibalism," he whispered. I'm talking about survival, Hayes corrected. The dead don't need their resources, Admiral. The living do. And there are so many dead out here in the void. So very many. Hayes gestured again, and the camera showed more of his medical facility. I saw equipment that had clearly been repurposed from legitimate medical functions: surgical tables, organ preservation units, chemical analysis systems, all being used for the systematic processing of human remains. Consider the mathematics, Admiral, Hayes continued with academic detachment. The average human body contains approximately 60 kilograms of usable protein, 15 kilograms of fat for energy production, and trace amounts of essential minerals. One person, properly processed, can extend the life of 10 others by several days. This is insane, Admiral Korath said, but his voice lacked conviction. Insane or practical? How many of your people are going to die when your food runs out, Admiral? How many could live if you simply acknowledge the resources that are already available to you? The transmission ended, but the Devourer remained in our sensor range, following our fleet like a scavenger tracking wounded prey. Other ships began reporting similar encounters, vessels that had once been rescue ships, exploration craft, even children's evacuation transports, now transformed into predatory horrors that hunted their former allies. Within days, we began receiving reports of ships that had gone missing entirely. The Morning Glory, a transport carrying civilian families, simply vanished from our sensors during a routine patrol. The Steady Hand, an engineering vessel, was found drifting empty, its crew gone, and its hull marked with the same twisted caduceus symbol we'd seen on the Devourer. But perhaps the most disturbing report came from the Crystal Harmony, whose captain had agreed to a meeting with Hayes and his crew. Captain Williams returned from that meeting fundamentally changed, immediately implementing what he called resource optimization protocols aboard his own ship. The first optimization was the elimination of what Williams termed non-productive population segments: elderly crew members, the disabled, and anyone deemed to have insufficient skills for survival operations. The second optimization was the establishment of biological resource recovery procedures for those who died from natural causes. Within a week, the Crystal Harmony had transformed from a civilian transport into something resembling the Devourer, and Williams began broadcasting his own recruitment messages to other ships, explaining how his new methods could extend their survival indefinitely. The Void was changing us all, but some had embraced that change more completely than others. And as I watched the tactical display showing the growing number of rogue vessels surrounding our diminishing fleet, I began to understand the true scope of our tragedy. We hadn't just lost our way home. We had lost our way entirely. The great armada that had set out to end a war had become something far worse than the enemy we'd been sent to fight. We had become monsters feeding on our own corpses, and the feast was just beginning. In the distance, the dead world rotated silently in the void, its ancient ruins standing as a monument to another fleet that had faced the same choice we now faced. They had chosen to fight each other for survival, and their bones littered the surface of a lifeless world. Looking at the growing chaos around us, at former allies turned into cannibalistic predators, at good people transformed into calculating killers by the endless hunger of the void, I realized we were making the same choice. The void had won. We were no longer the Great Armada. We were just its latest meal. By the 5th month, we were down to fragments. The Great Armada that had once numbered 23,000 ships had been reduced to scattered clusters of survivors, drifting through the void like the remnants of some cosmic shipwreck. The Meridian's edge now led a group of fewer than 800 vessels, the last ships that still maintained any pretense of military discipline. I had aged years in those months. Looking in the mirror had become an exercise in confronting a stranger. My hair had gone gray at the temples, my face was gaunt from reduced rations, and my eyes held the same hollow look I'd seen in too many others. The void changes you even when you try to resist it. Admiral Korath's condition was worse. The weight of command, the guilt over what our fleet had become, the constant stress of trying to hold together what couldn't be held. It had broken something fundamental in him. He still gave orders, still maintained the facade of leadership, but I could see the madness creeping in around the edges. Status report, Commander, he said as I entered his ready room for our daily briefing. The space that had once been immaculate was now cluttered with star charts, resource calculations, and psychological evaluation reports. The walls were covered with pictures of ships, hundreds of them, with red X's marked over the ones we'd lost. "We received 3 distress calls in the last 24 hours, sir," I reported. "The Distant Hope reports complete life support failure. The Steadfast has suffered a reactor breach and is requesting immediate evacuation. And the Morning Star." I paused, struggling with how to phrase the next part. "What about the Morning Star, Commander?" "They've gone quiet, sir. Last transmission was a request for medical supplies to treat what Captain Voss described as behavioral modifications among his crew. When we tried to respond, we got no answer." Korath nodded slowly, then reached for his pen and made another red X on the wall. "Ship number 697. Any word from our scouting parties?" The Swift Arrow returned from the outer perimeter. "They report contact with a group calling themselves the Harvest Fleet, approximately 50 vessels operating under Captain Morrison's command. They're actively hunting smaller ships and," I hesitated, and offering recruitment opportunities to crews willing to join their operations. They're promising extended survival times in exchange for participation in what they call resource recovery activities." Korath laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Resource recovery. Is that what we're calling it now?" He stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the scattered lights of our remaining fleet. "Do you know what I dream about, Commander?" "Sir?" "I dream about the day we launched. 47,000 ships, millions of souls, all united in common purpose. We were going to end a war, Chen. We were going to bring peace to the galaxy." He turned back to me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Instead, we became the war. That afternoon, we received a transmission that changed everything. It came on a frequency we hadn't used since our first week in the void, an old emergency channel that had been reserved for communication with lost vessels. The signal was weak, distorted by distance and interference, but the voice was unmistakably human. "This is Captain Elena Rodriguez of the Distant Star, broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. If anyone from the original fleet is still receiving this, please respond. We've found something. We've found a way out." I nearly fell out of my chair. Captain Rodriguez had been presumed lost 2 months earlier when her ship had vanished during a routine supply run. But here she was, alive and claiming to have found escape from our predicament. The response from our fleet was immediate and overwhelming. Every ship tried to transmit at once, creating a cacophony of desperate voices pleading for more information. It took nearly an hour to establish a clear communication link. When Rodriguez finally appeared on our main screen, she looked different. Older, worn down by whatever she'd experienced during her absence. But there was something else in her eyes, something that might have been hope. "Admiral Korath," she said, her voice carrying across the void. I wasn't sure any of the command structure still existed. "Captain Rodriguez, it's good to see you alive. We feared the worst when you disappeared." "I almost didn't make it," she admitted. "My ship was attacked by a group of rogue vessels, former members of our own fleet. They disabled our engines and boarded us, but instead of taking supplies, they took my navigator and my chief engineer. Said they needed them for some kind of project." "What kind of project?" Rodriguez's expression darkened. "They're trying to build a new wormhole gate, Admiral, using salvaged parts from destroyed ships and other resources. They've established what they call collection points throughout the void, places where they gather materials and personnel from captured vessels." The implications were staggering. If someone was actually attempting to construct a functional wormhole gate, it could mean rescue for some of us. But the methods being employed. "Rodriguez, you said you found a way out. Are you talking about this gate project?" She shook her head. "No, sir. What I found is something else entirely. During my escape, my damaged ship was pulled off course by a gravitational anomaly. What we discovered there..." She paused, as if struggling to believe it herself. "There's a derelict structure in the void, Admiral. Massive beyond anything we've ever seen. And it's not natural. Another dead civilization? No, sir. This one's still active. Barely, but active. And whoever built it, they knew we were coming. The revelation sent shockwaves through what remained of our fleet, an active alien presence in the void, something that had been waiting for us, expecting us. The questions multiplied faster than we could process them. Over the next few days, Rodriguez transmitted detailed scans and navigational data about the structure she'd discovered. The images were breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. The construct appeared to be some kind of massive space station or habitat, easily 100 times larger than our biggest dreadnoughts. Its architecture was alien but purposeful, clearly designed by an intelligence that understood both the physics of deep space and the psychology of desperation. But it was Rodriguez's description of her contact with the structure's inhabitants that truly captured our attention. They call themselves the custodians, she explained during one of our briefings. Near as I can tell, they're artificial intelligences left behind by whoever originally built this place. They've been maintaining it for, well, they measured time differently, but they implied it's been millions of years. What do they want? Admiral Korath asked. That's the strange part, sir. They don't want anything from us. They're offering us something, a choice. What kind of choice? Rodriguez took a deep breath. They can send us home. All of us. But there are conditions. The silence that followed was profound. After 5 months of hopeless struggle, someone was offering us exactly what we'd been praying for. But experience had taught us to be suspicious of easy answers. What conditions? I asked. We have to give up our ships. All of them. The custodians will provide transportation back to our galaxy, but we go as passengers, not as a fleet. And she hesitated. And we have to agree to forget. Forget what? Everything that happened here. The fighting, the cannibalism, the way we turned on each other. They have the technology to selectively edit memories. They say it's a mercy, that the psychological damage from what we've experienced would destroy us even if we made it home. The debate that followed Rodriguez's revelation split our remaining fleet down the middle. Some saw it as salvation, a chance to return home and resume their lives without the burden of traumatic memories. Others viewed it as a betrayal of everyone who had died, a way of escaping responsibility for what we'd become. Captain Sarah Chen of the Dawn's Promise was vehemently opposed. We can't just pretend none of this happened, she argued during one of our fleet conferences. 22,000 ships are gone. Millions of people are dead. Their families deserve to know the truth. But Captain James Morrison of the Stellar Dawn, not to be confused with the rogue Morrison who had turned to piracy, disagreed. What truth? That we turned into monsters? That good people became cannibals and slavers? What purpose does that serve except to spread the infection of what we've become? I found myself torn. Part of me wanted nothing more than to forget the horrors I'd witnessed, to return home and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But another part of me felt that forgetting would be a betrayal of everyone we'd lost, everyone who had sacrificed themselves or been sacrificed by others. The decision became even more complicated when we began receiving transmissions from the various rogue factions scattered throughout the void. Word of the custodians' offer had spread, and different groups were making different choices. The Harvest Fleet, led by the cannibalistic Morrison, rejected the offer entirely. They had become something beyond human, and they seemed to prefer their new existence to returning to a civilization that would never accept what they'd become. The survivors of Dr. Hayes's Devourer sent a chilling message. Why return to a galaxy full of sheep when we have learned to be wolves? The void has taught us the truth about survival. We will remain and continue our education. But other groups embraced the offer with desperate enthusiasm. The crew of the Eternal Hope, which had been reduced to fewer than 50 survivors, transmitted a simple message. Please, we just want to go home. As the days passed and more ships made their choices, a disturbing pattern emerged. The vessels that chose to return home were being attacked by those who had chosen to remain. The rogue factions seemed determined to prevent anyone from leaving the void, as if the existence of witnesses to their transformation was itself a threat. The attacks were vicious and coordinated. The Morning Glory, which had been limping toward the custodian structure, was ambushed by a group of modified ships that had once been peaceful exploration vessels. The entire crew was killed, their ships stripped for parts and their bodies processed for resources. It became clear that reaching the custodians would require fighting through our former allies who had embraced the darkness of the void. The irony was bitter. To escape the hell we'd created, we would have to become part of it one last time. Admiral Korath made the announcement during what would be our final fleet-wide communication. All vessels choosing to return home will form a convoy under my personal command. We depart in 72 hours. Anyone who wishes to remain in the void may do so, but understand that you forfeit any claim to protection from the fleet. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nearly 600 ships requested to join the convoy, leaving fewer than 200 that chose to remain. But as we began forming up for our final journey, the true cost of our transformation became apparent. Many of the ships requesting to join the convoy were no longer fit for civilized society. The Iron Will had become a slave ship, its crew divided into castes based on survival value. The Stellar Pride had implemented a breeding program that treated human beings like livestock. The Phoenix Rising had established a religion based on resource worship that included ritual sacrifice. These ships wanted to go home, but they wanted to bring their new customs with them. They saw nothing wrong with the adaptations they'd made to survive, and they couldn't understand why Admiral Korath was insisting on a return to inefficient humanitarian principles. The conflict was inevitable. 3 days before our scheduled departure, the first shots were fired between ships in our own convoy. The Iron Will had attempted to raid the Peaceful Dawn for inefficiently allocated resources, leading to a firefight that destroyed both vessels. What followed was the final battle of the Great Armada, not against an external enemy, but against ourselves. Ships that had fought side by side for decades turned their weapons on each other in a last desperate struggle between what we had been and what we had become. I watched from the bridge of the Meridian's edge as the convoy tore itself apart. Energy beams crisscrossed the darkness, turning the void into a battlefield lit by the dying fires of our civilization. Ship after ship fell to friendly fire, their crews choosing destruction over compromise. Admiral Korath stood at the command post, tears streaming down his face as he watched the final destruction of everything he'd tried to preserve. "Signal the custodians," he said quietly. "Tell them we're ready for pickup." "Sir, most of the convoy has been destroyed. We're down to fewer than 30 ships. "Then tell them to pick up 30 ships, he replied. "It's better than none." As the Meridian's edge limped toward the custodian structure, its hull scarred by weapons fire from our former allies, I found myself thinking about the ancient ruins on the dead world. Another fleet, another time, but the same ending. The void had claimed another armada, turning its strength against itself until nothing remained but wreckage and regret. The custodians were waiting for us, their massive structure growing larger as we approached. Soon, they would take us home, erase our memories, and allow us to pretend that none of this had ever happened. We would return to our families as heroes, never knowing that we had become the very evil we'd been sent to destroy. But I would know. Somehow, despite whatever technology the custodians used, I would remember. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to understand that the greatest armada in galactic history had not been destroyed by an enemy, but by the simple, inexorable hunger of the void. And somewhere in the darkness behind us, the last fires of our great fleet continued to burn, fueled by the hatred we had learned to feel for ourselves. Other ships began reporting similar encounters, vessels that had once been rescue ships, exploration craft, even children's evacuation transports, now transformed into predatory horrors that hunted their former allies. The void was changing us all, but some had embraced that change more completely than others, And as I watched the tactical display showing the growing number of rogue vessels surrounding our diminishing fleet, I began to understand the true scope of our tragedy. We hadn't just lost our way home. We had lost our way entirely. The great armada that had set out to end a war had become something far worse than the enemy we'd been sent to fight. We had become monsters feeding on our own corpses, and the feast was just beginning. In the distance, the dead world rotated silently in the void, its ancient ruins standing as a monument to another fleet that had faced the same choice we now faced. They had chosen to fight each other for survival, and their bones littered the surface of a lifeless world. Looking at the growing chaos around us, I realized we were making the same choice. The void had won.